Well, I mean, I don't see myself as a victim, and I would agree with Jordan that I think that people need to take personal responsibility. But I also think that it's a little bit short-sighted to say that the world is equal or that the patriarchy doesn't exist. I mean, for me as a woman, just living in the world, it's very obvious to me that the patriarchy exists.
What?
They would have advanced any of the arguments.
No, but what they would.
No, they wouldn't.
Yes.
They would have advanced their own timely misinterpretations of the situation, but those don't bear any resemblance to what I'm putting forward.
They bear a strong resemblance to me.
In what way?
But shouldn't we tackle them? Shouldn't we attempt to tackle them rather than just explaining them or describing them or giving them gendered identities? Wouldn't it be better to actually say,
first of all, we don't give them gendered identities.
How can we enact real social change? When you're talking about things being so innate, Judith Butler would have said that, gender is a construct, that gender is a performance.
Well, Judith Butler doesn't know what she's talking about in the least.
Jordan Peterson, coming back to you. The book you've written is very much about, it begins with this notion of balance between order and chaos. I mean, you draw on Tao and the ideas of yin and yang. The subtitle of your book, though, is, and what's important there is balance between those two things, but the subtitle of your book is An Antidote to Chaos, not the middle way between order and chaos, an antidote to chaos. Why an antidote to chaos rather than the middle way?
Well, I think the middle way is the important way, but I think at the moment that our culture is suffering from an excess of chaos. We have a moral relativism as a fundamental ethos. We're detached from our underlying religious metaphors and stories. People in universities in particular, I see this, are in crisis in relationship to their culture and their vision and destiny, especially among men, although certainly not exclusively. And we've emphasized individual rights rather than responsibilities in the West for like 3 generations. And so I think there's a tremendous imbalance at the moment, and I was trying to rectify that in part.
One of the reasons when you give talks that you get protesters attending as well as adoring fans is, I think, that you've gendered order and chaos.
Well, I haven't.
Well, you haven't. You say you haven't. You say you've inherited a gendering. Why should they be gendered at all?
Well, because our fundamental cognitive axioms are social cognitive. We see the world as a gendered place. We see the world through a social lens. I mean, we evolved in a social environment, and so our deepest intuitions are to interpret the world as a set of characters, and those characters come gendered. And generally speaking, Mother Nature is a representative of chaos because she's destructive but also plenipotential, I would say, and order is patriarchal, which everyone uses that metaphor.
I thought you didn't believe in the patriarchy.
I don't.
So why I'm slightly puzzled as to how you can have a distillation of gender in one sense as a social inheritance, but not.
Well, the word patriarchy in our culture has become synonymous with arbitrary tyranny and oppression. And I don't regard our culture as arbitrarily tyrannical or oppressive. And I don't believe the narrative that pits women against men or men against women as the core narrative of our culture. I think that's absurd.
Well, I want to pick up that word arbitrary because you talk also about consciousness as being masculine. You have a moment in your book where you say Neumann and Jung, who is very important to you, say that consciousness was masculine.
It's symbolically masculine.
It seemed almost comically transparent to me that they decide what gender are we going to apply to consciousness? Well, we're men. It probably looks like us. You write this as well. It is certain that a woman needs consciousness to be rescued, and as noted above, consciousness is symbolically masculine and has been since the beginning of time. But consciousness is an intellectual concept. It doesn't have a gender.
What makes you think it's an intellectual concept? Consciousness isn't an intellectual concept. Well, it's a phenomenon.
It's a thing in the world, but women...
Yes, so our conceptualization of it is an intellectual construct.
In what sense is it masculine?
It's masculine symbolically, and the radical investigations of... that's a core element of fundamental mythology. It's been a principle of metaphorical cognition for forever. It's not an arbitrary decision by any stretch of the imagination.
It is an inherited decision, but I'm curious again about the way in which you treat some cultural inheritance. As you write this as well, we've learned to live together and to organise our complex society slowly and incrementally over vast stretches of time, and we do not understand with sufficient exactitude why what we are doing works. it seems to me that begs a very large question, which is, works for whom? A lot of people think that it doesn't work. That's why social change comes about. That's why societies and civilizations alter over time. So, works for whom?
Well, it might be better to ask works compared to what? So there's a handful of societies in the world, perhaps 30 or 40, that are functioning at a pretty high level. Those are the countries that everyone wants to immigrate to. And there's inequality within those cultures, but you can't lay that at the feet of those cultures. Inequality is a much deeper problem than anything you can lay at the feet of an economic or political system. And so works, in my estimation, is works by historical standards, including the standards of the last 150 years.
Can I just want to put one thought experiment first,
Sure.
and then I will bring you in. 120 years, I assume you agree with female suffrage, that
Sure.
women should have a vote. Well, 120 years
It's a good
ago,
assumption.
120
Fair
years
one.
ago, I felt I had to check. 120 years ago, that would have been a radical and disruptive idea to have. People would have advanced exactly the arguments you advance about inherited social traditions, about the way things have been done. Scientists would have advanced information. A phrenologist would have come along, I don't doubt, and said, well, you know, women's bump of electoral selection is smaller than men.
They would have advanced any of the arguments
they would.
No, they wouldn't.
Yes.
They would have advanced their own timely misinterpretations of the situation, but those don't bear any resemblance to what I'm putting forward.
They bear a strong resemblance
in
to
what
me.
way?
Because you're drawing on what has been done as some endorsement of what is done in the future.
Why is the description of the fact that consciousness has been described mythologically as masculine an endorsement of it? The fact that I'm pointing out something exists in the world isn't an endorsement of it, any more than me pointing out that hierarchies exist is an endorsement of it.
No, but I think you're being a tiny bit disingenuous, because there is a sense of endorsement in the sense that you think we shouldn't struggle against this in our social arrangements. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted Louise O'Neill.
I was really interested there when you said that we can't blame culture for inequality within it. So
that's absolutely the case.
So
well, inequality is rife in the animal world.
Okay.
Well, so how do you blame that on human culture or the West?
You don't, but why?
Yeah,
we're not animals.
Yes.
For starters, we're not animals.
Well, I'm not justifying that. I'm saying that, look, there is lots of problems with the fact that there are hierarchies, but the problems with the fact of hierarchies are far deeper than you can use a sociological explanation.
But shouldn't we tackle them? Shouldn't we?
I never said anything about the utility or lack
rather
thereof
than
of
just
tackling
explaining them or describing them or giving them gendered identities. Wouldn't it be better to actually say?
Well, first of all, we don't give them gendered identities.
How can we enact real social change?
That's a certain perfectly reasonable question.
As I said at the beginning, there's a great deal in the book of Jordan with which I agree with. But let's just deal with this point. I disagree with you, where you talk about functional hierarchies. You say that they're based on competence rather than power, and therefore actually that what we shouldn't be looking at when we're looking at functional hierarchies is sort of we need to move away from victimhood, start working on your competence, and the power structures will be functioning in some way for you. But then I just don't understand and follow that, because how do you then explain so much mediocrity in places where there are so many people who clearly don't have the competence and yet are in positions of power, in positions of authority, in positions in which they're dominating purely by an accident of birth, through the connections and networks that they have. And finally, the bar, for example, my profession as a barrister, is one of those bizarre ironies that when you're in the profession itself, it's probably one of the most meritocratic professions, because once you stand up in front of a judge, you better have the answer. Nobody cares about who your father is. But getting there is the least meritocratic, because actually so much will have to have happened to you in order to get there. But actually being in there, it really is about how good you are, determines how far you go. And so that's an example of functional hierarchies at one end clearly being dominated by accident of birth and power, but in the other by competence. And to ignore the two is just very simplistic, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. Well, I mean, the evolutionary biologists have already established that in human hierarchies there's two routes to success, let's say, power and competence. And degenerate hierarchies use power as the means of establishing.
So you're saying people have corrupted it?
Well, hierarchies in general tilt towards corruption. So that would be the motif of the tyrannical king. It's a very old idea. And one of the things that people have to do as individuals is fight against the fact that tyrannies tend towards corruption. And as they become corrupt, people who use power dominate them. And then they turn into tyrannies. Now, the problem is with terminology like the patriarchy and our general discussion of the patriarchy, we're making the reverse assumption, which is that the fundamental nature of our hierarchical structure is predicated on power and oppression. And I don't believe that that's fundamentally true in the West, even though it is definitely the case, as you pointed out, that every hierarchy is corrupted by power.
Lawrence Wright, do you want to come in on this? You write in your book, the danger in holding on to a myth is it becomes like a religion we've stopped believing in. It no longer instructs us, it only stultifies us. That sort of lit up for me after reading your book, because you're very strong on what myths can teach us and how useful they are. There is a danger to them as well, isn't there?
You know, this discussion leads me to think, I've written a lot about terrorism, and I've spent a lot of time in societies that we're not talking about here. We're not talking about the West. We're talking about societies that are profoundly broken. And there's no single cause of terrorism. But it's not like the lack of education. It's not like gender inequality. It's not tyranny. You can isolate each of those and say that's not the cause of tyranny. But despair is the common element. And in societies where people are frustrated, especially young men, have no route to power at all, then they're given an alternative. And one of those alternatives is you can go kill yourself, and you will make history.
You find salvation in the hereafter.
Yes, that's right.
You get
Surrender
an identity
here
out of it as well.
And
so the high school shooters do.
And you do your suicide video and sort of thing, and you may get a poster on a telephone pole somewhere along the line, and you're remembered. And that is, I think, a concrete example of what we're talking about is this, the total feeling of inaccessibility of power. And this is one route terror is to that.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we see that in the West as well. In Ireland, 80% of all suicides are by young men. Men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than by women. And that is, again, I think, an inability to express themselves, because men have not traditionally been given enough space under patriarchal society to be vulnerable, because they see vulnerability or expressing that sort of emotion as being weak, and that's why I think that the rates of mental health issues and suicide are so high amongst young men, particularly in Western societies.
Jordan Peterson, I noticed, I don't think it was it'd be wrong to characterise it as a flinch, but a reaction when Louise was talking. You've written this as well. If men are pushed too hard to feminise, they will become more and more interested in harsh fascist political ideology. That seemed to me an odd thing to say.
It's a standard psychoanalytic idea. It's not a harsh thing to say at all. If you deny people's essential nature, competitive nature, for example,
isn't it
there's going to be a kickback? And to think of that as enculturated purely is just incorrect.
Yes, but isn't it the classic abuser's exculpation? It's a withdrawal from responsibility. You pushed me to it. You made me hit you.
It's not a justification. It's just an observation of what's likely. If you push people too far in a particular direction, it's a warning, not a justification.
But the solution to that is not to worry about feminising men. It's perhaps to worry about men joining fascist organisations.
No, I think it's to worry about the sorts of things that Lawrence already talked about, and the probability that steep, unequal hierarchies will produce desperate young men. And that's actually a critique of hierarchy, by the way.
Louise O'Neill.
Yeah, I have 2 points there. I suppose the first one is that when you talk about, feminizing men, it almost sounds derogatory. It's almost as if you're saying that to be feminine or to express any sort of femininity is actually inferior to masculinity. And I think that is a huge problem, even within the language that we use. When you say, don't be such a girl, don't be such a pussy, the greatest insults that men can give each other tend to have feminine origins, like, as I said, pussy or faggot, or anything like that. And I think, again, that speaks to a very systematic inequality between the genders. And
you attributed the rates of mental illness among men to their inability to express, say, sentimental emotions.
Well,
and I don't think there's a shred of clinical evidence to support that stance.
No.
I don't think there's a shred of evidence to support that stance. The kind of violence, for example, that Lawrence is discussing is a consequence of competitive competitive violence among young men as they move
I think there
forward.
is some evidence that men find it difficult to talk about things, and that
and they also
ways
find
in
it
which
hard
you can
to
help
reach
young
out.
men to talk about things.
And that's the
reduces-
evidence for the differential rates of mental health
And
suffering?
I also don't think when you're talking about things being so innate, Judith Butler would have said that, gender is a construct, that gender is a performance.
Well, Judith Butler doesn't know what she's talking about in the least, so I don't accept that.
I mean, that's interesting, but
she's no scientist. She doesn't know the psychological literature.
Well, then if you look at someone like Cordelia Fine, who wrote The Delusions of Gender,